My name is Margaret Ellison. My son left me on a mountain trail and never looked back. Trust me, you'll regret skipping this story. So before you sit back and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. Now get in the mood to listen to this story because it might be the ultimate sweet revenge. It started with silence. The kind that doesn't feel peaceful, the kind that crawls over your skin, seeps into your bones, and whispers, "Something's wrong." I was standing at the edge of a forest trail, the wind nipping at my cheeks, and I just knew he wasn't coming back. He'd said he was going to grab his phone from the car. We'd stopped halfway up the mountain trail, one of those scenic routes. People like my son Daniel always posted on social media to make life look a little better than it was. He told me to sit on a bench that overlooked the valley and wait. He'd be right back. That was 3 hours ago. The sun had shifted. I had no phone, no bag, no coat, just a fleece blanket he'd tossed to me from the back seat like an afterthought. And I could feel it, that eerie, sinking feeling like I'd been unhooked from the rest of the world. At first, I made excuses for him. Maybe he got hurt. Maybe the car wouldn't start. Maybe there was no signal, and he had to hike down for help. That's what any mother would believe, right? Mothers don't jump to the darkest conclusions, not about their own children. But then I started remembering, noticing, everything he didn't say this morning. The way he rushed me into the car. How he didn't look me in the eye when I asked where Emily, his wife, was. The strange stillness in his voice when I asked if he packed my medication. He hadn't. I remember gripping the seatbelt as we climbed the winding road. I joked about how quiet it was up here. Peaceful, I said. He nodded but didn't smile. His jaw was tight. His hands on the wheel were pale. It wasn't peace. It was preparation. I sat on that bench for a long time, fighting my instincts. I wanted to believe in him. I wanted to believe that I hadn't raised a man who could abandon someone who could abandon me, like trash left on the roadside. But when the wind shifted and I heard no engine, no footsteps, no rustle of gravel behind me, just the endless drone of birds and branches, I understood. This wasn't a mistake. It was a decision. He chose to leave me here. And somehow that truth hurt more than the cold. You don't spend decades raising a child just to become their burden. But that's exactly what I'd become. I could see it in how Emily flinched when I cleared my throat too loud. In how Daniel asked if I really needed to keep all those old photo albums. In how dinners got quieter, shorter, colder. He used to call me Mama even as an adult. But lately, it was just Mom. Flat. Unfeeling. And when he thought I wasn't listening, it became her. She always wants something. She's not even sick, she's just old. I didn't sign up to take care of her. That's what I overheard through thin apartment walls. I ignored it. I chose to ignore it. I told myself they're stressed. Young couple. Mortgage. Long hours. I made excuses because that's what mothers do. We love them beyond reason, beyond reality, even when they start to turn into strangers. But this wasn't stress. This was strategy. I stood up from the bench, knees, stiff lips cracked, and looked down the path. I wasn't strong. Not anymore. 68 with bad hips and a heart that fluttered when the air got too thin. I wrapped the blanket around myself and started walking because staying still meant dying. The forest didn't care about betrayal. The trees just watched, old and silent and unmoved by human cruelty. And as I took each careful step, something inside me hardened. Something old and buried, the part of me that had cared for the dying, sat beside grieving families, wiped blood and tears and vomit from strangers. The part that had always known the difference between weakness and mercy. I didn't cry. Not yet. Not then. I wasn't ready. The sun began to fall behind the ridge, casting long shadows through the trees. I couldn't walk much farther. My legs buckled once and I had to lean against a mossy rock, heart pounding, ears ringing. The cold gnawed through the blanket into my skin. That's when the memories started coming fast, sharp, uninvited. Daniel as a boy curled up beside me during thunderstorms, the way he cried when he skinned his knee and wouldn't let anyone but me touch it. The night his father died, how he held my hand whispering, "It's just us now, Mama." Those moments were real, weren't they? Or had they always been part of a story? I told myself a fiction stitched together by need and nostalgia. Was this always who he was? Or did I just raise a man who learned how to hide it well? When the moon began to rise, I started whispering to myself. Not prayers, not pleas, just memories. Names. My mother's cornbread recipe, the name of my childhood dog. Anything to keep my mind sharp, anything to stay conscious. And in that brutal, beautiful silence, I made a promise. If I lived, if I wouldn't let this end with me freezing quietly on some forgotten trail, I would tell my story. Not for revenge, for truth. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is survive. I wasn't always this sharp. Or maybe I was. Maybe it just dulled under the weight of love, which has a funny way of making you blind to the obvious. When I think back now, really think I see every sign that led me to that mountain. The breadcrumbs were there all along, they just looked like affection until they rotted into something else. A mother's eyes don't miss much. But her heart. Her heart edits the truth. Daniel used to call me every Sunday without fail. After his father died, we clung to each other like survivors from a shipwreck. His calls became shorter over the years, 5 minutes, then 2. Sometimes they stopped altogether unless he needed something. But I didn't want to be dramatic. I told myself, he's busy, he's building a life. That's what I raised him to do. But what I really raised him to do was walk away without looking back, and I didn't know it until it was too late. There were subtleties, small acts that cut deeper than outright cruelty. The way he started sighing every time I asked a second question. The way Emily would accidentally cook meals she knew I couldn't eat, then act surprised. The locked cabinet where they kept snacks I used to buy for Daniel as a child. Now I wasn't allowed to touch them. I started labeling my yogurt cups with a Sharpie just so they wouldn't get thrown out. Like I was a stranger in someone else's home. I once knocked over a glass and bent to pick it up. Emily just watched, arms crossed. When I finally got it, she muttered, "We really need to child-proof this place." I laughed nervously. She didn't. That's when I knew. I wasn't part of the family anymore. I was the problem they didn't know how to solve. And Daniel? He stopped seeing me. No worse, he saw me. He saw the way I lingered in the hallway trying not to get in the way. The way I offered to cook only to be told they had it handled. The way I went to bed earlier and earlier just to disappear politely. He saw me fading and let it happen. I told myself he was stressed. He was tired. But a man doesn't let his mother eat dinner in silence while he scrolls on his phone, not unless he wants her to feel invisible. When I tried to bring it up gently, his jaw would clench. "Mom, don't start. Don't start." As if my pain was an engine that needed turning. I remember one moment, one stupid little moment that plays like a scratch on vinyl over and over. We were at the grocery store and I picked up a box of cookies he used to love as a kid. I held them up smiling. "You still love these?" He barely glanced at them. "Yeah, I don't eat junk anymore, Mom." Then he walked ahead without waiting. Emily smirked. He's got different tastes now. It wasn't just about the cookies. It was about everything. My memories didn't matter. My past didn't matter. My version of him no longer existed. I started writing in a notebook at night quietly in bed. At first it was lists, groceries, things to remember. Then they became something else. June 3rd. She told him I left the window open. I didn't. June 6th. Daniel took my chair at dinner without looking at me. June 9th. They went to the movies. Didn't invite me. June 11th. They discussed assisted living options when they thought I was asleep. That notebook became my secret mirror. a place to remind myself I wasn't crazy, that this was really happening, that I wasn't paranoid, just patient. Because when you've spent your life watching people die, and I had as a hospice nurse, you know when someone is slowly pulling away. Not from life, but from you. They withdraw their warmth first, then their words, then their eyes. And finally, you're just a ghost in the house. There was one night I almost confronted them. We were sitting at dinner, tense, wordless, when Daniel said, "Emily's been thinking we should take a trip. Just us. To reconnect." He looked at me, then quickly looked away. I nodded. "That sounds nice. All of us." Emily blinked. "We thought it might be good for you to have the house to yourself." I smiled, but my throat burned. "Of course. That's thoughtful." Thoughtful. That word hung in the air like a noose. The trip changed after that. Suddenly, it was a road trip instead of a vacation. Suddenly, it wasn't Emily and Daniel going, it was just Daniel and me. A bonding experience, he said. A mother-son thing like old times. I wanted to believe it. God, I wanted to believe it. But he never once asked if I wanted to go. He just said, "Pack light." The night before the trip, I woke up with a knot in my stomach. I opened the door quietly and saw the light under their bedroom door. Voices. "She won't remember half of it anyway," Emily whispered. A pause. "She's just tired. And it's not your job to keep picking up after her." And then Daniel's voice. "It's too much, Em. I can't live like this anymore." I stood there barefoot on the cold floor, feeling every thread of my identity unravel. But I said nothing. I walked back to my room, laid down, closed my eyes, and decided I would go on that trip. Because some stories, you have to live through to tell properly. She wore her cruelty like perfume, light enough to be missed by strangers, but strong enough that I could feel it on my skin for hours afterward. Emily was polite, too polite, the kind of woman who smiled with all her teeth and none of her warmth. At first, I mistook her poise for grace, her assertiveness for competence. But over time, the shine dulled, and what remained was sharpness. Cold, calculated sharpness, the kind that cuts without needing to raise its voice. She didn't yell. She never told me outright that I wasn't welcome. She just crafted a world where I barely existed. The first time I noticed it was at dinner, 2 months after I moved in. I'd spent the afternoon making roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans, all from scratch, just like I used to when Daniel was little. I set the table with the linen napkins, the nice silverware, tried to make it feel like home. Emily walked in, sniffed the air, and said, "Oh, I didn't realize we were doing heavy food tonight." Then she opened the fridge, pulled out a salad she'd made earlier, and placed it on her plate like my meal wasn't even there. Daniel followed her lead. They ate like I was the housekeeper who'd overstepped. That was the first time. But not the last. She found subtle ways to shrink me. I'd mention a story about Daniel from childhood, and she'd steer the conversation somewhere else. If I sat in the living room to read, she'd accidentally blast her podcast on speaker nearby. When I did laundry, I'd later find it refolded, always with a note of correction. Once she handed me a pamphlet titled "Staying Independent After 65. She said I picked this up at work, thought it might be helpful. I thanked her, smiling through the sting. I used to believe women like Emily were born from bad mothers. Now I think some people are simply carved out of ice, and no amount of warmth ever melts them. But what hurt more, what gutted me, was how my son let her become the wall between us. Daniel wasn't always like this. He used to ask for my advice on everything. Whether it was which apartment to rent or what to say in a job interview, I was his sounding board, his compass. But once he married her, my voice became static. She'd lean over at family dinners and whisper something to him, and he'd nod before I even finished speaking. Sometimes they'd exchange looks, silent judgments that turned my stomach. She didn't even hide it. I remember one day in the kitchen, she stood beside me while I cut fruit, watching me with her arms crossed. Daniel said you used to be a nurse, she said. I replied, not looking up. Hospice work, right? That must have been depressing. It was sacred, I said, slowly slicing through an apple. To be there at the end when people are most afraid. That's when the real work starts. She smirked. Well, I hope we never need that kind of care. And then she walked away just like that, leaving her message wrapped in sweetness, dipped in venom. They never had children. Emily always said she was too focused on her career, but I knew better. She didn't want to share Daniel with anyone. She had him on a leash, invisible but tight. And he, for reasons I may never understand, liked it that way. He told me once before they got married, Emily keeps me grounded. I wanted to ask what part of you is trying to float away, but I didn't. Because mothers know when silence is the only kindness left. There was one day, a stormy Tuesday. I remember it well when I heard them arguing. Real arguing, not the quiet kind. Their bedroom door was cracked open. Emily's voice sharp. She's in the way, Daniel. Daniel quieter. She's my mother. She's not your child. You don't owe her your life. I just need time. She doesn't have anywhere else to go. And what if she never leaves silence? That silence was the answer. Not just to Emily, but to me. I was standing in the hallway holding a basket of laundry that suddenly felt like bricks. My hands were shaking. I hadn't cried in years, but that night I folded socks with tears falling silently into the pile. I wanted to scream, to confront her, to remind her who raised the man she clung to like property. But I didn't, because I knew the person I needed to confront wasn't Emily. It was Daniel. She didn't drive the car that left me on the mountain, but she might as well have steered the wheel. When Daniel came up with the idea for the trip, I saw her by the kitchen sink washing mugs, back turned. She didn't say a word. But when I asked her if she was coming, she gave me a look that answered everything. No, she said without facing me. You two need time. Need time. How funny, looking back, that time was the very thing they wanted me to run out of. The day we left, she helped me carry my bag to the car. She hugged me stiffly and whispered, "Try not to overthink things, Margaret. Just enjoy yourself." I should have felt warmth. I should have felt inclusion. Instead, I felt like a box being sealed and labeled, "Return to sender, unwanted." Emily wasn't just a daughter-in-law. She was the echo of every woman I'd cared for in hospice who had no one by their side when they passed. I remember their eyes searching the doorway, hoping for a son or daughter to walk through just one more time. And when no one came, I held their hand and told them they were loved. But now I wonder how many of those children had wives like Emily, people who turned love into inconvenience, mothers into burdens, legacy into embarrassment. I don't hate her. Hatred gives someone power. Emily doesn't deserve mine. What she deserves is the truth spoken in a voice that doesn't shake, a voice that doesn't beg, a voice like mine. You can live in a house and still feel homeless. I sold my place after Daniel and Emily offered for me to stay with them for a while. The words were wrapped in good intentions, and at the time I was tired. The upkeep of my little cottage, the endless repairs, the slow leaks and creaking floors, it all felt heavier than it once did. They made it sound like a gift. "We have the space," Daniel said. "It'll be easier for all of us," Emily added. So I signed the papers, handed over the keys, and let go of the place where I'd spent my happiest years. The place where Daniel took his first steps. Where I buried my husband's old work boots behind the shed. Where silence had once felt comforting, not punishing. I thought I was trading that house for a family again. For laughter in the kitchen, shared dinners, the warmth of belonging. But all I really got was a room at the end of a hallway. It was small, painted in gray-blue tones with a view of the neighbor's fence. There was a twin bed, a dresser, and a chair that made my back ache. No TV, no bookshelf. No sign that I'd ever had a life of my own before I entered theirs. At first, I tried to make it mine. I hung up a framed photo of Daniel at age 10, the one where he's holding a papier-mâché volcano and grinning like he invented fire. I put my patchwork quilt on the bed and lit a lavender candle when they weren't home. But slowly, quietly, the room began to shrink. Daniel asked me not to burn candles. Emily's sensitive to smells, he said. The picture frame disappeared one day. I found it behind the dresser broken. The quilt was replaced with a neutral comforter that matched the house better. They weren't trying to make room for me. They were making me fit into their space, sanding off the edges until I barely recognized myself. I used to walk around the block every morning just to escape. Neighbors would smile, some nod politely. No one knew I lived only 2 doors down from Daniel and Emily's pristine white fence. No one knew that I was invisible inside. One day, I tried to bake a pie peach, his favorite. Emily came home early and saw the flour on the counter. Please just ask next time, Margaret. We have a system. A system. That word hit me harder than any insult. A system is for warehouses, for recycling centers, for places that process things they no longer need. It got to the point where I learned to move soundlessly. I knew the exact pressure points on the floor to avoid creaks. I memorized the timing of their showers, meals, phone calls, and took care not to overlap. I became a ghost in real time, watching my own life fade out scene by scene. One evening, I walked into the living room while Emily was on the couch. Daniel sat beside her watching some nature documentary. I stood there a second too long and she looked up. Do you need something? I opened my mouth, then closed it. No. Just passing through. That's what I'd become, a shadow passing through my own family. It's funny how quickly love can curdle when left in the wrong hands. Daniel stopped asking how I slept. He stopped saying good morning. Eventually, he stopped saying anything unless it involved the thermostat, the groceries, or reminders to text if I left the house. It was like living with a landlord who once kissed your scraped knees and called you pumpkin. One night, I knocked on their bedroom door. I was shaking. I don't even remember what I planned to say. Maybe I was going to apologize for what I'm not sure, for aging, for taking up space, for daring to exist. Emily opened it halfway. Yes, I just wanted to ask if Daniel. I started. He's asleep. She started to close it. But I said something I hadn't said in months. I miss him. She didn't blink. I'm sure he appreciates that, she said. Good night. And the door clicked shut. I sat in my room after that for hours. I stared at the blank wall across from my bed and wondered how I got here. How a woman who once led entire hospice teams, counseled grieving families, made impossible choices at impossible hours. How that same woman became someone who was afraid to knock on a door in her own home. Home. The word felt foreign now. Like it belonged in another language, one I used to speak fluently but had forgotten. I started writing in the notebook again. But now it wasn't just notes. It was plans. Not revenge. Not yet. Just outlines. Thoughts like, what would happen if I left? Where would I go if I didn't have them? What does surviving look like when you're not anyone's priority anymore? I knew I wouldn't be invited to stay forever. I knew Emily was waiting for the right moment, the right excuse to suggest something permanent. Assisted living or a small place nearby. All said with a smile, of course, with those soft, toxic tones she'd perfected. But I wanted to choose the moment before it was chosen for me. That's why I said yes to the trip. That's why when Daniel knocked on my door early one morning with a duffel bag and a stiff smile, I didn't hesitate. It'll be good to get out of the house, he said. I nodded. Yes. Let's get some air. I didn't pack much. Just enough to remind myself that I existed. Daniel told me it would be a refreshing change of scenery. That's what he called it, refreshing, like we were just two people taking a quick breath from our usual routines. As if I had a routine. As if invisibility was something I needed a break from, not a sentence I'd already been serving for over a year. I remember the way he didn't quite meet my eyes when I opened the front door that morning. He had the engine running and the duffel bag already in the trunk. No coffee, No breakfast. No, you ready, Mom? Just, we should get on the road before traffic builds. Emily didn't come outside. She stood behind the curtain in the living room window thinking I couldn't see her, watching us like someone checking if the trash had finally been picked up. I didn't wave. Neither did she. The car ride started in silence. No music. No conversation. Just the rhythmic groan of tires on pavement and the occasional tap of Daniel's finger against the steering wheel. I watched the trees blur by. Summer was bleeding into fall, the leaves still green but heavy with the weight of change. "You remember the old cabin we used to rent?" he asked after nearly an hour. I smiled softly. "Of course. You caught your first fish there. You were terrified of it." He chuckled. It felt forced. "This trail's not far from there," he said. "I thought maybe we'd take a short hike." "Like old times." "Just us?" I asked. "Yeah," he replied quickly. "Emily had work stuff." That was a lie. Emily worked remotely. She could have come. She just didn't want to. Or maybe she didn't want me to. Either way, I didn't push it. I looked out the window and I started to realize I wasn't going on a trip. I was being removed. When we pulled into the trailhead, I noticed how few cars were in the lot. 3, maybe 4. Daniel parked close to the edge near the tree line. "I thought this was popular," I said, eyeing the quiet woods. He shrugged. "It's a weekday. Less crowded." He popped the trunk and handed me a small fleece blanket, the kind you keep in the back seat for emergencies or cold sports games. No hiking stick, no water bottle, no backpack. "Did you bring my bag?" I asked. "Just a couple things." "It's light," he said, closing the trunk before I could see inside. Something flickered in me, then the first spark of suspicion, but I smothered it quickly. I didn't want to think like that. Didn't want to believe that my own son could be capable of whatever this was becoming. He led the way down a gravel path winding between thick trees and uneven slopes. I followed carefully, feeling the way the earth pulled at my knees with every step. "You okay back there?" he called over his shoulder. "Fine," I lied. "Just taking it slow." The trail forked, and he chose the narrower path, the one less walked. The one with no signs, no benches, no markers. "We won't go far," he said. "Just up to the ridge." I nodded. I didn't realize at the time that it was up to the point of no return. When we reached a clearing about half an hour in, he stopped. "This is nice," he said, breathing heavily. Quiet. It was. Almost too quiet. I looked around dense trees, a distant view of the mountains, and no cell towers in sight. No trail maps, no hikers, just nature and a creeping sense of dread. Daniel sat down on a log and motioned for me to do the same. I did, wrapping the fleece around my shoulders. The wind was stronger here, sharper, colder. "I'm gonna head back to the car real quick," he said after a few minutes. "I forgot my phone." I blinked. "You left your phone?" "Yeah, just realized. You didn't bring a bag either." He hesitated. "It's in the car." "I'll just be a second. You want me to come?" He smiled tight, unnatural. "No need. Just stay here. I'll be right back." And then he turned. He didn't look rushed. He didn't seem concerned about me being alone in the middle of nowhere, wrapped in a blanket without water or a phone. He just walked. And I watched him go. I waited. For 5 minutes, then 10, then 30. At first I made excuses. Maybe he got lost. Maybe he tripped and twisted his ankle. Maybe he had to take a call and was walking slowly to get a signal. But slowly, excruciatingly, I began to understand. He wasn't coming back. He had never intended to. I stood suddenly dizzy with the realization. My body ached, but adrenaline kept me upright. I walked a few steps back toward the path, heart hammering. I called his name once. Twice. The forest answered with silence. The trees didn't care. The wind didn't pause. He was gone. And I was alone. That's when the questions came. Why now? Why here? Why this? But I already knew. Because Emily was tired of the burden. Because Daniel had begun to see me not as his mother but as weight. Because leaving me in a place like this offered something no confrontation could deny ability. If something happened, he could say he lost track of time. He could cry and say, she wanted to hike. He could stand at my funeral and give a eulogy that started with, she loved the mountains. But he didn't plan for one thing. I didn't die. Not on that trail. Not in that wind. Not from that betrayal. If anything, I woke up. Because there is a strange, powerful clarity that comes when the person you love the most tries to erase you and fails. They say betrayal feels like a knife in the back, but that's not quite right. It's slower, quieter, a gradual unraveling of warmth replaced by the steady chill of disbelief. It doesn't stab, it sinks into your skin, your breath, your bones. I sat there wrapped in that thin fleece blanket, trying to tell myself it wasn't happening, that my son hadn't just walked away and decided not to return, that I wasn't in this very moment being discarded like a forgotten bag of groceries. But no matter how I spun it, no matter what thread of logic I clung to, I couldn't escape the truth. Daniel had left me, on purpose, and the cruelest part, he did it kindly. No screaming, no slamming doors, just a soft voice and a smile as he told me to rest on a log in the forest. Like you'd tell a dog to stay before disappearing into the car and never coming back. I tried to stand, but my legs were stiff. My hip was already aching, not a sharp pain, but the kind that warns you of what's coming if you push too hard. There was no trail map, no reception. And I had no idea which direction led back to the car, or which direction would take me deeper into the woods. I took slow, deliberate breaths, focused on the present moment. I thought of my training. When I worked hospice, we taught families how to keep loved ones calm during decline, the breath work, the touch, the reassurances. I used to guide people through death. Now I was guiding myself through survival. I didn't know how long I sat there before I forced myself to stand again. I wrapped the blanket tighter, looked to the west where the sun had begun its quiet descent. That's when I realized it wasn't just the betrayal that hurt. It was the planning. He'd packed nothing for me. No snacks, no water, no phone, no coat. Not even my medication. Everything I needed was conveniently forgotten. And the blanket, I kept coming back to that blanket. It was a gesture so symbolic it felt almost theatrical. Just enough to soothe his guilt. Just enough to say I gave her something. A prop in a play where the main character doesn't survive the second act. I started walking. Not toward safety, just away from stillness. I knew if I stayed put, I wouldn't last. The cold would slip deeper into my joints and I'd become one of those stories in the news. Elderly woman found dead on hiking trail. Son says she wandered off. What a neat little headline that would be. Except I wasn't going to be a headline. I wasn't going to be his excuse. I followed the slope of the land, guessing that the incline we walked earlier meant the car was parked somewhere downhill. Every step was a guess, every branch a warning. Birds chirped overhead. The breeze brushed the trees. Nature indifferent moved on around me, and that's when the grief hit sharp, sudden breath-stealing. I stopped walking and screamed. Not words, just noise. A raw, guttural cry that tore its way from my stomach to the sky. I screamed until my throat ached, until I collapsed to my knees, until silence returned like a judgment. No one answered. No one came. Not him. Not anyone. I thought of the times I stayed up through the night at his bedside when he had the flu. The way he'd cry into my arms and ask if he was going to die. How I'd stroke his hair and whisper, "Not while I'm here, sweetheart. I won't let anything happen to you." I would have died for him. And now he'd be happier if I did. It's a funny thing, the moment you realize your love was never truly returned, you think it will break you. You think you'll collapse under the weight of it, but I didn't. Instead, I felt something else rise in me. Not anger, not hate, precision. A kind of cold awareness that cuts cleaner than fury ever could. Because I knew then that this wasn't an impulsive act. This had been building. Slow and calculated. He'd watched me get smaller in his life, and instead of reaching out a hand, he wondered how much longer until I disappeared altogether. I was doing him a favor by vanishing, and for the first time in a very long time, I didn't want to do him any more favors. The sun dipped lower. Shadows stretched across the forest like long fingers. I kept walking, my body screaming at me to stop. But my mind was alive with clarity. I started thinking about all the things I knew, all the things I still had power over. I thought about the documents I'd helped Daniel sign when he needed a co-signer for his business loan. I thought about the letters he'd sent me over the years, handwritten, vulnerable, sometimes foolishly candid. I thought about the email I once saw on his laptop screen, a conversation with Emily about other options for my care. Cold, unfeeling language. I remembered everything. Because while my bones might ache and my breath might shorten, my memory was intact. And I was not done yet. Eventually, I stumbled onto a wider path. I don't know how I got there. Instinct, maybe. Or God, if he still listens. The trail looked familiar. Worn. Almost welcoming. That's where the hikers found me. 3 of them, young, talkative, stunned to see a woman my age limping along in the near dark, wrapped in a blanket and covered in dirt and leaves. "Are you okay? Did you fall?" I wanted to say yes. That it was all just a mistake. But the words stuck. Because it wasn't a fall. And it damn sure wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. I didn't tell them the truth. Not yet. I told them I got turned around. That I lost track of time. That my son and I were separated and he probably went for help. They called emergency services. I was taken to a small urgent care clinic nearby. The nurse asked if I had someone to call. I shook my head and said, "Not anymore." That night, while lying on the stiff exam table, I stared at the ceiling tiles and began to write the story in my head. Not just for me, for every woman who'd ever raised a child only to be cast aside when her usefulness expired. For every mother who mistook tolerance for love. And for every son who'd ever thought they could get away with it. The cold teaches you, not just in the way it stiffens your fingers or numbs your lips, but in how it strips everything down to its core. Out there in that mountain air, there were no distractions, no conversations to soften the silence. Just the truth, raw, shivering, and unmovable. You learn what you're really made of when no one comes for you. You learn who you are when survival becomes personal. That night after the clinic discharged me, I sat in the corner of a quiet diner with a cup of tea I could barely hold. My hands trembled. My clothes still smelled like pine and fear. The waitress gave me that careful smile people give women who look like they've just come back from something unmentionable. She asked if I needed her to call someone. I told her no. And that was the moment it became real. I didn't have anyone to call. Not anymore. My phone was still in Daniel's car if it hadn't already been smashed, sold, or buried under a new lie. I had no keys, no purse, no identification. Just my name and a mind that suddenly felt sharper than it had in years. As the tea cooled in front of me, I thought about what I did have. I had memory. I had stories. And I had time, a future he never expected me to survive long enough to see. Because when Daniel walked away on that trail, he made a fatal mistake. He assumed that all I'd ever be was a fading woman with tired eyes and a slow gait. That I would freeze. Be found. Buried. Forgotten. But what he didn't account for, what Emily didn't account for, was that cold preserves. And I came back colder than ever. The next morning, I went to a women's shelter. They didn't ask many questions. just gave me a cot, a warm meal, and the kind of silent dignity that feels like grace when you've lost everything. It was there, among the soft murmurs and shared pain of other women, that I began to piece myself back together. A volunteer named Lisette helped me file for a temporary ID. I told her bits and pieces, enough to give her context, not pity. I didn't need pity. What I needed was power. And slowly it returned. Like blood rushing back into a frozen limb, painful but alive. I spent a few days just breathing, just sleeping, just remembering how to speak my name without apologizing for it. Then I started writing again. Not in the old notebook that was left behind, but on paper scraps, napkins, receipts, anything I could get my hands on. I wrote down every conversation, every red flag, every detail I could recall from the weeks leading up to the trip. I mapped out the emotional breadcrumbs Daniel and Emily had left in plain sight. I chronicled the change in his voice, the look in her eyes, the specific wording of just the two of us. Because I was no longer a woman recovering, I was a woman preparing. The shelter had a public library across the street. I went there often, sitting at the computer for hours. I created a new email. I researched laws. I looked up old contacts, people I hadn't spoken to in years, friends who had once admired the way I stood my ground during impossible hospice cases. And when I felt ready, I made two decisions. First, I wasn't going back to their house. Not ever. Second, I wasn't going to keep this secret. Some betrayals demand exposure. I filed a police report. Not because I expected charges, I knew how slippery emotional neglect could be, how easily Daniel would claim it was all a misunderstanding. But because I wanted it on record. I gave them the story in clean, calm language. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I told them what happened, the timeline, the missing phone, the lack of supplies, the trail he chose. The officer, a woman in her 40s, sat very still when I finished. "That's abandonment," she said softly. "I know," I replied. "Why didn't you call sooner?" I looked her straight in the eyes. "Because I had to survive it first." Later that week, I received an envelope in the shelter's mail bin with my name scrawled in familiar handwriting. It was from Daniel. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single-page letter. "Mom, I don't know what to say. I didn't mean for anything bad to happen. I just thought you needed space, and maybe I did too. Emily's scared. So am I. Please don't do anything drastic. Let's just move on. Daniel." I stared at the words until they blurred. Scared. What did he think I was going to do? Disappear quietly? Apologize for making it out alive? He wanted to move on, but I had just begun. What the cold taught me more than anything is that people will choose comfort over truth every time if you let them. They will rewrite your pain to suit their image. They will frame survival as drama. They will call your memories confused and your instincts paranoid. Unless you speak up. Unless you refuse to be edited. I burned his letter in the shelter's courtyard that night. Watched the paper curl and blacken under the flame. Not as an act of hate, but as a burial. Because what he gave me in that letter wasn't an apology. It was a request for silence. And I had already spent too many years being quiet. Rescue doesn't mean repair. Being found isn't the same as being whole again. When the hikers spotted me on the trail, they saw a woman in distress, shivering, lost, confused. But they didn't see the history. They didn't see the betrayal woven into my blanket or the weight of the son I no longer had. They saw the surface. And that's what most people want, a surface they can understand. So I gave it to them. I got turned around. I lost track of time. He probably went to get help. Lies that felt cleaner than the truth. Easier to swallow. Because what was I supposed to say? My son left me here to die, and now I'm trying to figure out how to live with that knowledge. No, I was too cold, too tired, and too aware that the world doesn't have a place for women like me, not unless we fit into tidy categories: grieving widow, forgetful elder, tragic, but harmless. I didn't want to be any of those. I wanted to be awake. The clinic treated me for dehydration and exposure. Nothing critical, just the warning signs: low blood pressure, swollen joints, and the kind of trembling that doesn't go away with heat. They asked if I had anyone they could call. I told them no. He'll come back eventually. I said it not because I believed it, but because I wanted to see how the lie felt in my mouth. If it tasted anything like hope. It didn't. Once I was discharged, I took a cab paid for by the clinic's social services fund to the nearest town. A kind woman named Claire, who managed intake at a temporary shelter, handed me a warm towel and a cup of broth. "You're lucky," she said. "People get left out there all the time. Most don't walk out." I stared at the steam rising from my bowl. It wasn't luck. No. No, I said. It was the refusal to be forgotten. She looked at me a long time after that, then nodded. "We've got space if you need it." I stayed 3 nights. During those days, I didn't do much. I slept, I watched, I listened. Most of the women in that shelter had stories that could burn cities to the ground, but they told them softly, not because they weren't angry, but because they were tired. We don't shout because we're weak. We whisper because we've already used up all our volume surviving. One night, over stale tea and cold cookies, I told a woman named Joan what happened. The real story. Her eyes didn't widen. She didn't gasp. She just said, "Yeah, that happens more than you'd think." And that's when the ache shifted from personal to universal. This wasn't just my story. It was the story of so many women who had given and given and given, and were still considered too much. After I left the shelter, I found a temporary apartment, small, quiet, with just enough light for a plant on the windowsill and a chair by the radiator. I didn't need much. Just silence that didn't feel like punishment. I spent the next few weeks rebuilding my foundation, reclaiming what had been stripped. I filed for a new driver's license, reopened my bank account. I contacted my old colleague Marla, who had since retired but still worked with a volunteer hospice network. "I thought you were gone," she said. I replied. But I came back with a story. She gave me space to tell it. And when I finished, she didn't ask why I wasn't pressing charges or calling Daniel or trying to get back into his life. She just said, "What do you want to do next?" And for the first time in years, I had an answer. "I want to tell the truth, but only on my terms." The truth doesn't need to be shouted to be heard. Sometimes it's more powerful as a whisper passed between women in kitchens, in shelters, in libraries, in the backs of church halls. I started writing. Every day, I sat in front of my small window and documented what happened not just on the trail, but before. The dinners I sat through in silence. The moments I was ignored. The things I let slide in the name of keeping the peace. It became a memoir of sorts. Not a formal one. Just pages of memory arranged with purpose. I didn't want revenge. I wanted witnessing. Because to be seen is a kind of justice. Daniel never tried to find me. No missing person report, no police visit, no phone call to the shelters. He let the silence stand, which told me everything I needed to know. That mountain wasn't a lapse in judgment. It was a conclusion. The end of something he no longer wanted responsibility for. But what he didn't realize, what Emily couldn't predict, was that their ending became my beginning. One morning, as I folded laundry in my tiny apartment, the phone rang. It was an old friend of Daniel's, someone I hadn't heard from in years. I saw something she said carefully. Emily posted online, a photo from the trail, said Daniel took it when he was out for a solo hike to clear his head. I laughed. Not out of bitterness, out of confirmation. They'd crafted their alibi before the engine had cooled. That was fine. They could keep their story. Because I had my own now, and mine was grounded in facts. Rescue is never about who pulls you out of the dark. It's about what you do after the light finds you. And I had no plans of retreating back into the shadows. Not anymore. People forget that nurses carry two kinds of knowledge, the clinical and the emotional. The first you learn from textbooks, but the second is something you earn hour by hour, death by death, breath by trembling breath. And that second kind, it never leaves you, even when you're no longer on the clock, even when it's your own child who's made you the patient. I used to tell my hospice team, there are two versions of every person, who they were before the diagnosis and who they become in the face of it. Turns out the same is true for betrayal. There was the version of me before the mountain, the mother who believed a cold dinner was just a bad mood, a forgotten birthday card was just a busy schedule. And then there was me after the mountain. And that woman didn't make excuses anymore. I sat alone in my apartment with two selves arguing inside me. The nurse in me understood Daniel's behavior. I could explain it clinically: emotional distancing, projection, caretaking fatigue. These weren't new concepts. I'd seen adult children do worse to parents with dementia, with cancer, with just the inconvenient act of aging. The mother in me, she couldn't forgive him. She didn't want diagnosis. She wanted an answer. She wanted to storm into his life like a hurricane and scream, "You left me to die." But the nurse held her back, because the nurse knew he wouldn't understand. Not truly, not deeply, because people like Daniel don't see the mother who stayed up all night after the fever. They don't see the woman who worked 2 shifts to keep the lights on. They see the new version, the one with thinning hair and slower steps. They see the burden, not the history. Some nights I sat at the window and imagined how it must have gone. He gets home. He tells Emily it's done. She probably hugged him, kissed his cheek, said, "You did the right thing." They open a bottle of wine. Maybe they scroll through real estate listings again, talk about converting my room into an office or a home gym. I wonder if Daniel thought about me when the sun set that evening, when the cold started to rise on the mountain. Did he picture me still sitting there? Did he hesitate? Or did he simply not care? The mother in me believes he hesitated. The nurse knows he didn't. When you spend years at deathbeds, you get used to the sound of unfinished business. It's not dramatic. It's quiet. Regret is almost always whispered, never shouted. I should have called her back. I didn't mean to say it that way. I thought I had more time. That's the music of dying. And I think Daniel's song has already started, he just doesn't know he's humming it yet. I went back to the police station a week after filing my report. The officer, the same woman from before, greeted me like I was something unusual, like I wasn't the typical case. I talked to my supervisor, she said. Technically, it falls in a gray area. Of course it does, I replied. Do you want us to contact him? I shook my head. No, I'm not looking for an apology. Then what are you looking for? I smiled gently. To be done. She nodded slowly. I think you already are? She was right. I didn't want to punish Daniel. I wanted to outgrow him. And the way to do that wasn't through confrontation. It was through clarity. I started volunteering again, not at the hospice, not yet. That would come later. I wasn't ready to hold someone else's ending while still processing the sudden rebirth of my own life. Instead, I offered to lead a writing circle at the shelter. We met twice a week. No one was required to read aloud, but some did. One woman, Darlene, wrote about her daughter who called her toxic for asking for help with groceries. Another, Tamara, wrote a poem about folding laundry in a home she no longer lived in. Their words weren't polished, but they were honest. And for the first time, I realized something that shook me to my core. What happened to me wasn't unique. It was common, which made it even more unforgivable. One day after class, I sat down with my notes and wrote a single line. What if survival isn't the ending but the beginning of your next truth? It was a thought that had grown quietly in me like moss on a stone. Maybe I wasn't meant to repair the past. Maybe I was meant to rewrite the future. And in this version, I wasn't the sad mother abandoned by her child. I was the woman who walked away from the edge. and never looked back. The nurse in me still checks the exits, still counts the medications in the drawer, still writes dates on the calendar in pencil, not ink. But the mother in me, she's quieter now. Not gone. Just different. Wiser. Stronger. A little colder. But not broken. Not anymore. They thought I was gone. Dead, maybe. Lost at best. And I let them believe that. Because sometimes survival demands silence, not to stay hidden, but to watch. So that's what I did. I played dead. I sat still while the world around them moved. I didn't call. I didn't post. I didn't knock on the door like some ghost begging to be let in. Instead, I watched from a distance. And while they celebrated my absence, I was building something. Not revenge. Not justice. Proof. The first thing I did was retrieve my digital footprint. Through the help of the shelter's legal counselor, I regained access to my online accounts. Old emails, cloud storage, bank records. I logged into the shared insurance portal Daniel had forgotten to remove me. And there it was. 1 month before the trip, we need to start looking at alternatives for Mom. It's not sustainable having her here. A few days later, she's slipping mentally. Keeps forgetting things. We can't be her full-time caretakers. Lies twisted into planning. Words meant for Emily typed by Daniel. He had started the narrative early, the slow gaslighting, the erosion of my credibility. But now I had it in writing. I documented everything. I printed messages, screenshots, emails, notes from doctors, dates when prescriptions were filled, proof I was functioning stable present. I built a timeline piece by piece. Every story has two sides. Daniel had written his version with implication and convenience. Mine would be written with evidence. I didn't need to tell the world right away. No angry Facebook post. No front-page scandal. What I needed was control. So I opened a P.O. box under my new name, Maggie Ellison, not Margaret. Maggie felt cleaner, lighter, like someone who'd been through fire and stepped out smelling like smoke, not ashes. And then I wrote a letter, not to Daniel, to everyone else. Dear, name. You may have heard a version of events about my recent disappearance. I want you to hear mine. On date, I was left at a remote mountain trail by my son Daniel. I was not lost. I was not confused. I was told to sit and wait. He never returned. I survived because I refused to believe that invisibility was the same as inevitability. I have since sought legal advice and have documented my full account. What you choose to do with this information is yours, but silence will no longer protect him, or Emily. I am not asking for sympathy. I am asking for awareness. Maggie Ellison, I sent copies to Daniel's employer, to my old family friends, to Emily's parents, and to 2 people I knew from our church people who gossiped like it was a sport and would spread the story like wildfire. I didn't need to ruin him. I just needed the truth to become inconvenient. Then I sat back and watched. The emails started coming within the week. First from Helen, an old neighbor. She said, "I never believed what he said about you. I'm so sorry." Then one from Carl, a former friend of Daniel's. "He told us you wandered off, that you'd been forgetful lately." Jesus, Maggie, I'm so sorry. Even Emily's cousin, someone I'd barely known, messaged, "If there's anything I can do, please let me know. What they did is disgusting. I never asked anyone to take sides. But people will, once you stop pretending to deserve the pain." One day, as I returned from the post office, a figure was waiting near my building. Daniel. He looked smaller. Not physically, he was still broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, dressed in a too perfect button-down. But emotionally, he had shrunk. Mama. He said it like it still held meaning. I let the word hang in the air between us like a rope already fraying. "I found you," he said. I shook my head. "You lost me. On purpose." His mouth opened, then closed. His eyes shimmered, not tears, not really. Just fear, trying on the mask of remorse. "Why are you doing this?" And I said clearly, coldly, I'm not doing anything. I'm just not hiding anymore. He tried the usual defenses. You're confused. It wasn't like that. I just panicked. Emily didn't mean I held up a hand. Don't use her as your shield. Not anymore. His face hardened. There it was, the real Daniel. The one who let go of my hand on the trail and didn't look back. He stepped forward. You've turned everyone against me? I smiled. No, Daniel. You did that. I just gave them the missing piece. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he said something I will never forget. I wish you'd just stayed quiet. And I replied, You almost got your wish. Then I walked past him, into my building, into my life, without him. The silence after that was deeper, not emptier, just cleaner. No more worrying if he'd show up at my door. No more guessing if I'd ever hear from Emily. The game was over, and I had won by walking away from the board. Now I spend my mornings with a cup of tea and a pencil in hand. I write. I read. I listen to birds outside my apartment window. There's a little girl upstairs who always runs down the hall laughing. Her joy echoes through the walls like sunlight on stone. Sometimes her mother apologizes for the noise, but I smile and say, let her laugh, because the world tried to silence me and I refuse to do the same to anyone else. They thought I was gone. They thought I was broken. But I'm still here, still watching, still alive. The letter wasn't born from rage. It came quietly like a tide pulling in after months of still water. I didn't write it to punish him. I wrote it because something inside me needed to be released. Not to Daniel, but to the world that had watched me vanish, assumed me weak, and moved on. It was time to speak. Not in whispers, not with excuses, but with clarity. I wrote the letter longhand, 2 full pages. No dramatic language, no theatrics. Just truth laid out like evidence in a courtroom. I addressed it to Daniel, but it wasn't for him. It was for the people who believed him, for the colleagues who thought he was a devoted son, for the family who pitied him for having such a needy mother, for the acquaintances who nodded sympathetically when he said, "She's just not herself these days," and most of all for the next woman, the next friend, the next employer, the next person who might fall for his practiced performance of decency. They deserve the truth. And I finally had the courage to give it to them. Daniel, you told people I wandered off, that I forgot where I was, that I needed help you couldn't give. But here is what you didn't say. You took me to a remote trail with no phone, no food, no medication. You told me to wait while you grabbed something from the car, and you never came back. I waited 3 hours. I walked alone. I was found by hikers. I was not confused. I was not unstable. I was abandoned. You prepared for it. In the days before you let your wife isolate me, you planted little stories that I was forgetful, difficult, depressed. You crafted the narrative you'd need once I was no longer around, and now I'm writing mine. I don't want your apology. I want my story to exist louder than your silence. I'm mailing this letter not just to you, but to the people who deserve to know who you are when no one's watching. I hope the weight of my survival makes you uncomfortable. It should. I printed 20 copies. 1 to Daniel, 1 to Emily, the rest to their workplace, their church, our extended family, and a few people I knew from our old neighborhood. I mailed them slowly, deliberately. I wanted time to settle between each wave, let the ripples stretch wide. I didn't wait for responses. They came anyway. My cousin Jill called me in tears. I had no idea, Maggie. I thought he was doing the best he could. That's what he told us. I feel sick. A neighbor I hadn't spoken to in 10 years left a voicemail. If you need a place to stay, even just to get out of town for a while, my door's open. Even Emily's own aunt emailed me. I knew she was cold, but this, I'm ashamed to be related. And then, Daniel responded. Not with words, with silence. He didn't call, he didn't write. But I heard through someone else that he took a leave of absence from work, that he'd been going through something personal. Yes, the truth. You see, some people fear exposure more than consequence. They can survive guilt, but they crumble under reputation loss. Daniel didn't care when he left me alone on that trail, but when his carefully curated image began to peel away, when people started asking questions, that's when it hurt. That's when the mirror cracked. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. I just sat with the quiet satisfaction of being believed, of no longer whispering to myself in the dark. A month later, an envelope showed up in my P.O. box. No return address. Inside a single sheet. You win. I don't know who you are anymore. I hope you're happy. D. I folded the note once, tore it slowly down the middle, dropped both halves in the trash, because the truth was I did know who I was. He didn't. Not anymore. And that was the most powerful thing I had left. The next day, I sent a final letter. Not to Daniel. To the woman who would replace me in someone else's life, the next mother, wife, or sister-in-law being treated like a burden. You're not crazy. You're not too much. You're not broken. You're just in a room full of people who benefit from pretending you are. Get out. Before they take everything and still say you gave nothing. Love a woman who survived being erased. Truth doesn't always come with thunder. Sometimes it arrives as a letter in a mailbox on an ordinary Wednesday. But once it's read, really read, it cannot be unheard. Lies are like scaffolding, they only hold weight until the wind changes. Daniel had spent years building his careful, subtle, believable. He wasn't the type to explode or accuse. That wasn't his style. His lies were told in quiet tones under the guise of concern. She forgets things. She's depressed. She needs help. Each sentence crafted like a brick laid with the mortar of practiced calm. He didn't want to seem cruel, he wanted to seem responsible, the kind of man who was doing his best under challenging circumstances. And for a while, it worked. Until the structure collapsed. Not all at once. Not like an implosion. No, it came down like a building after an earthquake. Jagged, slow groaning. And I watched it fall. The first crack was at his job. He'd always been known as dependable, a team player. He once told me he was the guy they called when things got messy. So when his supervisor received my letter along with screenshots of emails and medical documentation proving I was in full cognitive health, that carefully built image began to tremble. He was called into a meeting. I don't know what was said. But I know what wasn't a denial. Because the truth about men like Daniel is that they don't deny. They deflect. They say things like, "It's complicated," or "She's making it sound worse than it was." But my story didn't need embellishment. It was worse than it sounded. Then came the fallout from family. His cousin blocked him on social media. An uncle removed him from a group text. My niece, someone Daniel hadn't spoken to in years, posted publicly, "Believe women," even when it's uncomfortable, especially then. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about how many people recognized what I described. That's what made it powerful. That's what made it impossible to contain. Emily tried to play damage control. She posted a photo of her and Daniel on a weekend hike with the caption, "Grateful for the strong people who hold it together when others fall apart." Subtle, petty, predictable. But the comments didn't go the way she hoped. One woman replied, "Holding it together by abandoning a senior citizen in the woods." Another, "Hope karma hikes faster." Emily deleted the post within hours. Then she locked her profile. Then she stopped posting altogether. I didn't need to hear their apologies. But I did hear their silence. And silence after exposure is its own confession. It says we don't have a defense. It says we thought she'd stay gone. It says we never expected her to survive long enough to speak. I began receiving messages from strangers. women who found my letter through secondhand forwards, colleagues who'd once worked with Daniel, even one of his old high school teachers. One message said, "Your story made me check in on my own mother. I hadn't called her in months." Another, "I was always uneasy around him. Couldn't put my finger on it. Now I know." And then one that stopped me cold. "I did the same thing to my dad. Not as far, not as cruel. But I pushed him out of my life because it was easier than facing my guilt. Your letter broke me. Thank you." Daniel never replied to my second letter. He didn't need to, because the fallout did something no confrontation ever could. It revealed him, not just to others, to himself. That's the thing about carefully curated personas, they only work when no one's watching. But once the light hits, once people start remembering differently, the whole structure comes undone. The story changes. And when the story changes, so does the man inside it. I know what you're thinking. Did I ruin his life? No, he did that himself. I just stopped hiding the truth. One afternoon, I sat on a bench near my apartment building watching the leaves fall. It was the same kind of day as when Daniel left me on the trail, crisp, golden, full of silence. I saw a couple walking by with a stroller. The woman glanced at me, then turned to her partner and said softly, "That's the woman I told you about." He nodded, holding the stroller handle tighter, and then she smiled, not pitying, not awkward, just recognition. I smiled back. And in that second, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: visibility. Daniel built a lie, one designed to slowly erase me. But the problem with lies is that they require constant maintenance. Truth, it just waits. It doesn't shout. It doesn't fight. It just survives. Until the moment someone's ready to hear it. And then it does exactly what it did to him. It ends the performance. He didn't knock right away. I heard his car first, the low hum of an engine hesitating outside my apartment building, the engine that once climbed a mountain and left me behind. I didn't look through the peephole. I didn't tense. I just waited. Eventually he knocked. 3 quick taps, like it was still his place to enter. I opened the door slowly. Daniel stood there, pale and hesitant, his mouth already forming a version of the story he hoped I'd accept. He was dressed neat as always, crisp collar, clean jeans, a man who liked to look like control. But the cracks were visible. Tired eyes. A small stain on his shirt he didn't notice. A silence in his stance. "Mama," he said. I let that word sit. Then I stepped aside, not to invite him in, but to let the truth pass between us. He walked in like someone visiting a museum of a past they no longer understood. He glanced around at the modest furniture, the stack of books, the teacup on the windowsill. "You look well," he offered. I didn't respond. I sat down. I didn't offer him a seat. He took one anyway. The silence was thick but not uncomfortable. It was earned. He looked at his hands for a long time, then finally said, "I didn't think it would go this far." I tilted my head. Go this far? As in people knowing, or as in me surviving? He winced. "I thought maybe we could talk. Start over." I let out a small laugh. Not cruel, just tired. "Daniel, I'm not a job you get to reapply for." He looked at me, then really looked. "Why did you send that letter to everyone?" "Because I lived." He blinked. "What I lived." And when people live through something that was supposed to kill them emotionally or otherwise, they don't owe their silence to the person who caused it. He leaned forward, his voice quieter. "I didn't mean to abandon you. I didn't know what else to do." "You did?" I said. "You just didn't want to do it." He looked away. I continued. "I was inconvenient. That's what it came down to. I didn't fit in your life anymore, and instead of being honest, you found a way to make me disappear." He started to speak, but I held up my hand. "I don't need the explanation. I've spent months inside it already." He stood up agitated now. You don't get it. Emily. She kept pushing me, saying we couldn't keep doing this, that you were draining us. I interrupted. Calm. Controlled. You let her speak for both of you. You let her reshape your love into a chore. You let her wear you down. And you let her convince you that getting rid of me was compassionate. His voice cracked. It wasn't like that. I looked him straight in the eye. Then tell me. What was it like? He opened his mouth. And for the first time in his life, Daniel had no answer. There was a long silence after that. He stared at the floor like a child who'd broken something irreplaceable and finally understood it. I could have filled that space with anger, with stories, with tears. But I didn't. Because some truths don't need to be shouted. They just need to be heard. He finally asked, Do you hate me? I looked out the window. No, I said softly, but I don't know you anymore. And I don't think I want to. His shoulders sagged. I thought I was helping. I stood. I walked toward the door and opened it wide. No, Daniel. You were helping yourself, and you thought no one would ever notice. He didn't move. I don't think I can fix this, he whispered. You can't, I said. Some things don't get repaired. Some things just end. He nodded, slowly, then walked out. I didn't watch him leave. I just closed the door behind him, not like slamming a chapter shut, more like setting down a book I've outgrown. Later that night, I wrote in my journal, just one sentence. Closure isn't forgiveness. It's choosing peace where pain once lived. And I slept without dreams, without fear, and for the first time in years, without waiting for him to return. The silence now is different. Not hollow, not heavy, not the kind that fills a hallway with unsaid apologies or hangs above a dinner table like a storm that never breaks. This silence is mine. I live alone, and I live well. My apartment is small, sunlit in the mornings, and quiet enough to hear myself think a gift I never realized I'd been denied for so long. There's no Emily slamming cabinets in the kitchen. No Daniel sighing heavily from the couch. No passive-aggressive footsteps behind my back. Just me. And the hum of healing. Some mornings I sit on my balcony with a cup of black tea and watch the people below. A young couple walks their dog. A teenager rides past on a bike, music leaking from her headphones. A woman my age does Tai Chi in the community garden across the street. We make eye contact sometimes, that woman and I. She gives me a respectful nod. Not curiosity, not pity. Just a look that says, I see you. And that's all I ever wanted. Not to be worshipped. Not to be rescued. Just to be seen. I started going to a small group that meets every other Thursday at the library. Women mostly. Older. Some are grandmothers. Some aren't. Some still speak to their children. Some, like me, stopped trying. We don't cry much. We don't complain. We tell the truth. One woman shared how her son moved her into a retirement home and then never visited again, not even once in 3 years. Another said her daughter cut off all contact after she declined to co-sign a loan. And when they finished speaking, we didn't pat hands or say, I'm so sorry. We said, you're not crazy. That happened to me too. You did what you could. Sometimes that's all a person needs to start breathing again. One night after group, I sat on the bus ride home, and the woman beside me, thin, quiet, with trembling hands, leaned over and whispered, Your story was mine too. Except I didn't get out. I turned to her and said gently, You did now. We rode the rest of the way in silence. A different kind of silence. The healing kind. There's something sacred about choosing peace when vengeance would be easier. Do I think Daniel wakes up thinking about me? Maybe. Maybe not. Do I think Emily checks her rearview mirror every time she pulls out of their driveway, wondering if someone's told the next truth about her? I hope so. But I don't need them to crumble, because they already did inside. You can't build a life on cruelty and expect it to last. Not really. Not where it matters. And I've stopped trying to measure my worth against their capacity to regret me. Some days I miss him. Or rather, I miss the boy I raised. The one with scraped knees and curious eyes who used to sing to himself in the bathtub and tell me he'd never leave me. That boy is gone, swallowed by something I can't and won't explain away. I've stopped asking where he went. Some mysteries deserve to stay buried. I joined the community garden this month. I plant tomatoes and snap peas and herbs I'll never finish cooking with. A teenage volunteer named Isaac helps me dig. He reminds me of Daniel at that age, awkward, kind, hopeful. But different too. There's no distance in his voice when he speaks to his own mother. He still calls her mom like it means something. That gives me hope. Not for me. For someone else. One afternoon, I brought the writing group copies of a short essay I'd published in a small local paper. The Art of Being Left Behind and Learning Not to Stay There. They read it slowly. When they finished, no one clapped. Instead, they nodded. And that meant more. When I get home from meetings, I light a candle. Lavender, my favorite. The same kind Emily said gave her migraines. I sit by the window, drink tea, and write. Not about him. Not anymore. Now I write stories about women who don't disappear. About women who return from mountains, literal or emotional, not as victims, but as witnesses. My story didn't end with abandonment. It started with acknowledgement. And the silence I live with now. It isn't the absence of noise. It's the presence of truth. I still walk sometimes. Not far. Just a loop around the neighborhood or down to the lake on quiet mornings when the sun hasn't fully decided if it's rising or not. The air is soft, forgiving. The kind of air that doesn't ask anything of you. And I walk alone. But not lonely. I walk to remember that my legs still work. That my lungs still fill with breath. That my story didn't stop where he left me. It started where I stood up again. There's a path behind the garden where the trail splits. One leads to the main road. The other curves gently toward a wooded patch with benches tucked away, almost forgotten. I go there when I want to sit and think. It's nothing like the trail he left me on, but sometimes my body still flinches when I hear gravel under someone else's feet. The brain remembers. The nervous system holds its secrets. But healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means remembering without fear. And that I've learned is a skill. A quiet victory. The last time I thought of Daniel for more than a passing second, I was baking. The kitchen was warm, the smell of cinnamon thick in the air. I reached for a wooden spoon, the one I'd used for years even before the betrayal, and I paused. I pictured him as a boy sneaking dough off the edge of the counter, laughing with powdered sugar on his nose, saying, "I love you, Mama," with absolute certainty. And I smiled. Not because I forgave him, but because that memory belonged to me. Not to who he became, not to what he did. It was mine, untouched, pure. That's the power of healing. You don't give the villain every page. You take your story back. I don't expect an apology. I don't need closure in a phone call or an email or a single tearful reunion. Because closure doesn't come from them. It comes from you. It comes when you realize that their inability to love you the way you deserve says everything about them and nothing about your worth. It comes when you can sit with your pain and say, "I see you, but you don't own me anymore." To the woman listening right now, the one who gave everything and got silence in return, the one who waited for a knock, a call, an apology that never came, the one who thought, maybe I'm too much, or maybe I'm too old, or maybe I should have just been quiet. Let me tell you something. You were never the problem. They just didn't want to carry the mirror you held up to their selfishness, so they broke it. But you are still whole, still walking, still here. I am not lost. I am not broken. I am not waiting. I am free. And if that freedom came wrapped in betrayal, I accept it anyway. Because it's mine. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've made it this far, you understand something most people never will. And maybe you have a story like mine, something you've never said aloud, a wound you've hidden, a betrayal you've buried just to stay functional. Don't keep it inside. Let it breathe. Tell someone, or write it down, or say it out loud to an empty room. Because even in silence, your truth matters. And if you ever find yourself alone on the trail, cold, forgotten, scared, remember this. You are not what they left behind. You are what came back. If this story touched you, I'd love to hear yours in the comments. Don't forget to like the video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe Grace's Truth for more stories like this. Stories that cut deep and heal true. You're not alone. Not anymore.